Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone to ProductTank Auckland, and I'm David James. I'm part of the co-organizer of the ProductTank Auckland chapter, um, and I'm joined with David Stoke, our webinar expert, and David Bland. Welcome, David.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I'm one of the lucky guy who went to San Francisco last year for the Mind the Product conference. And this is when I saw you for the first time, David, and you had an amazing talk about experimenting ideas and how this help businesses and people to influence the business. And I assume that's kind of the trailer of your new book, Testing Business Ideas. I'm very, very happy to have you today to talk us more about how we can experiment and better understand what is valuable for our users. So before we start our talk, I just want to give some Zoom etiquette for everyone in the call. Maybe it's the first time you're joining a Zoom webinar. At the bottom of the Zoom, you've got two very important buttons. One is the chat, and the other one is a Q&A. At the very end of the talk, David's talk is going to facilitate the Q&A session with David Bland. And he's going to use the Q&A, all the questions you put in the Q&A section of the Zoom in order to facilitate this conversation. Meanwhile, you can use the chat button to share your thought about what you're hearing and participate and give some feedback. It's very hard for us during a Zoom webinar because we don't have any feedback loop. So if you can give some information about what you're hearing and how you're feeling about what you're hearing in the chat, it will be awesome. And now I give it over to David.
Cool. Let me share my screen here. Oh, can you hand it over to me? Yeah. All right. So let me start this. All right. So yeah, I just want to thanks everyone for letting me kind of drop by and chat about stuff with you all. I've learned a lot since the talk in San Francisco. That seems eons ago now, but last summer it was it was amazing. The product community for Mind the Product is so amazing. I feel like to an extent it's like my tribe. So every time I get a chance to hang out with folks, I really relish in it. But I've learned a lot since then. You know, the book wasn't out yet, and we've been kind of pushing these ideas for a while, but it's always different, obviously, when some people are looking through the book to apply it to. So I just want to kind of share some stuff, a little bit of behind the scenes with you all since the book came out in November. But yeah, pretty much me, you know, I do a lot of, I play a lot in this world of design thinking, right? And lean startup and business model innovation. So it's just the combination thereof, I feel like, is kind of like more than the sum of its parts. So it's just awesome to kind of blend those together. And so basically what I'm going to talk about is a lot of that kind of work. And again, I'll be bringing from the book. So if you look in the book, we have 44 experiments in the book. I will talk about some of them with you all today. If you have already purchased the book, I would ask you to please leave a review if you've enjoyed it. We have 153 reviews right now on Amazon, and we're about 4.5 or so out of 5 stars. So it's been received pretty well. But basically, we just said, look, we see a gap. And so this whole question of like, why write a book? I feel like it's almost like you really don't want to write a book just to write a book. It's such a large kind of waterfall-like year-long endeavor it took us at least a year. You don't want it to be like just this business card, at least from my point of view anyway. It needs to be something that really helps people. So when I was speaking with Alex Osterwalder about this, and you may all know of him from like Business Model Canvas and the Value Prop Canvas and the 2 books which those came out of, which was Business Model Generation and Value Prop Design. He also has a new book now. It's like a machine. He just launched one this month called Invincible Company, which is about patterns. We were working through like visualizing why we'd write a book. We thought, you know, we see some patterns in the teams we were working with and how they how they don't really balance business design and testing. And so to draw a little bit with you all here, if you have an idea, you kind of want to take it forward, and I fully appreciate that. But first, you should really consider business design in your idea too, if you're testing a business idea. And so this idea of, okay, we're going to ideate on what's possible, so possible opportunities, what markets we'd want to play in, is there space at all for something like this? Let's create some business prototypes where it's more around, prototyping some canvases, what are potential options, and then how do we kind of assess those opportunities? A lot of that is also within regards to Invincible Company. We touch on it in this book, but he also expands upon it in the Invincible Company. And then how do you make a decision? Okay. And so from there, it's really, well, what is our risk and how do we actually go go after that risk? And so, for example, you'd want to sort of like create some hypothesis about where you think your risk is, and then run an experiment to go learn about that risk, right? And then based on what you learn, kind of feed that back in to your decision making. So in a way, it's almost like this kind of figure eight where you're going through over and over again this sort of cycle, and I think what happened was, and I grew up in the lean startup community and the agile community. I actually spoke in New Zealand. I keynoted a conference in 2015 on lean in Wellington, and I visited Auckland there too. Beautiful, amazing. Looking for a reason to come back. You all have a beautiful country. But even then, it felt like, wow, we're still kind of in the early adopter phase of this. And when you think about lean startup, which I'm a huge believer in lean startup, I've had the pleasure of working with Eric Ries in the past. I fully, if you've read any of my stuff, that I've been evangelizing this for a while. I feel like it addresses a lot of just this side, it's not so much on the business side. And when you think of kind of business model generation and canvas work, like a lot of it's over here. So it makes sense that we're balancing the two, because what happens is before you scale the idea, you want to test your way through this, generate some evidence, and then realize, okay, we got something here. I think the challenge that we face is sometimes we go really heavy on one side versus the other. And then we end up with this situation where I was like, oh, well, we're solving a job to be done, but we don't have a business model we can't sustain. And that's really, really challenging spot to be in. It's really frustrating. So I really love this quote from Theodore Levitt, which is, people don't want a 1/4 inch drill. They want a 1/4 inch hole. And so when I think about kind of like why write a book, it was not so much about like, it was more about a job, right? And I'm thinking of like applying this stuff to my own work, obviously, for what job, okay, does this book solve? And so when you think about it that way, we're like, okay, well, what would be the guiding story? And we have this, which is kind of what I would say is the job story for the book. And it's when I have a business idea, I want to be able to rapidly test it so that I don't build something that nobody wants. When you think about it that way, it's like, oh, okay. So people go hire some things for that job, but we thought there was a gap in between how to choose and match it to your risk. Okay. So really what it comes down to with regards to design thinking, and you've seen this from, Mind the Product community, of course, too, this desirability, viability, feasibility. So desirable, viable, feasible. And pulling from design thinking principles here, we thought, okay, well, there's three big questions with your business idea that you're going to need to ask. The first one is more like a do they question, which is very much a desirability. Okay. Viability ends up being more of this kind of should we question. And I have to say, out here in Silicon Valley, we should ask that question much more, not just from a business model point of view and cost and revenue, but also from a moral compass point of view, like, should we actually build this thing? And then the final question is, can we? Which is very much a feasibility question. And with regards to can we, where I slightly differ from kind of the other framing of this is, I think it's beyond technical feasibility. You should talk about regulatory feasibility. I know a lot of tech that where people could build it, but then you take it into a hospital and they say, oh, this violates like personally identifiable information or HIPAA compliance or some regulation where we can't share details, so we can't actually implement your thing. And so I like framing that more than just, just technical feasibility. And when you think about the roles, you should have some folks in your organization. They might come from like research or design who can help you understand some of these questions with regards to desirability. Okay. And then with the should we question, there's some folks probably from, finance, product, right? That can help you kind of align to the strategy and make sure that this stuff is aligned to where we want to go. Is it something we should be working on? And then on the backstage, this idea of, well, of course we're going to need some tech leadership, but maybe we also need legal and maybe someone from safety. But you should be able to find people that can help you answer some of these questions with regards to, look, if we miss out on one of these, there's a chance that the whole thing fails spectacularly. Okay. So ideally, I know this is like typical Venn diagram stuff here, but ideally you want to be able to say, we're validating desirability, viability, and feasibility in the idea. So one of the polls we thought we'd run to get a feel and temperature check from all of you is when you're testing your ideas, which is the most difficult to run? Like, what do you feel like is the most difficult? Is it desirability, the do they question? Is it viability with the should we, or is it feasibility with the can we?
Cool. So I'll run up the poll there for you, David. Just going to launch it
Okay.
now, so if everyone can provide their answer. Alrighty, so we're looking at 58% desirable, 33% viable, and 12% feasible.
Okay. Yeah, and so it's a balance of each one, right? And your risk tends to move around is what we found out as well. So what we've been doing and what Alex has been doing with Eve, his co-author, and also I've been pushing forward is this idea of, okay, let's take the business model canvas from Alex and can we layer this thinking on top of it? So desirability, viability, and feasibility. And it's not, it's not perfect, but it lines up pretty close where we say, okay, from a desirability point of view, what are the things with risk around your customer and your value proposition and how you reach them and how you build relationships with them? And then viability is a lot around, okay, do we generate more revenue than cost? And feasibility is more with regards to backstage, And so this is something I talked about in San Francisco, Mind the Product too, which is try to figure out where your risk is in the flow, okay? And I don't think a lot of people understand like the systems thinking behind the canvas. They view it as like a bunch of check boxes, but certainly not Alex's intent. But if you think about it, your value prop and your customer segment, okay, those are two big things that jump out as far as, okay, if we get these wrong, it almost doesn't matter what you do with the rest of your business because you're just going to have a solution frantically searching for a problem to solve. Then it's how do you reach them and how do you build relationships with them? But then pretty quickly you should talk about, okay, well, how do we make this sustainable? How do we make money? So when I look at risk early on, a lot of it usually is up front stage. Do we have the right value prop? Do we have a customer that has a real need? Can we get to them? Will they pay for it? Then backstage, can you actually pull off the key activities? So think about verbs, okay? Verbs here. So what are the big key things you need to be doing? Resources are more nouns. So think about what are the things we need? So is it patents? Is it IP? Is it something about hardware, software, an app, whatever that is for you. And then how much does that cost? And usually you take your costs from your activities and resources and you say, okay, back to the napkin, here's what it's going to cost. And then finally, like, who do you partner with? And if you think it from a systems point of view, you're delivering value to your customer, okay? And then you're building relationships with them in some regard. and then your customers in some manner are generating revenue for you, okay? And then backstage, you can take your cost, like I said before, with activities and resources, and you can start figuring out what your costs are. And then when you're partnering with somebody, partner with them because they bring a resource or an activity that helps you build your value prop, you know, and maybe they create a channel for you or something. But my point is, it's all related. And I think, you know, when I'm teaching like in an accelerator out here in Silicon Valley, people were like, well, yeah, I've used a canvas before, but they've never used it like this. They just took this check the box mentality and said, okay, we have a value prop. Okay, we have a customer. And whereas, yeah, they just pile in stuff that there's so many stickies, I can't even make sense of it anymore, or so many bullet points. And really the biggest value you're going to get out of it is storytelling and visualizing what happens if you pivot on your customer, or you pivot on your channel, or you pivot on your revenue stream. Like, what are the ripple effects in your strategy? And that's what I think people miss out on. So we are trying to work with this to make it kind of not less like a list of stuff, which it was never really intended to be, but that's how it's kind of been adopted, and say, okay, let's put another layer of information on it to help you start unpacking where your risk is, right? So basically what we've done is, you know, have some exercises where you write down your assumptions around once you fill out your canvas and have your business design kind of in flight. And then a simple 2x2 exercise. And I have to say, I've tested this thing for, I don't know how many years and how many hundreds of teams. It's really interesting. I first picked this up, this idea from Jeff Gothelf and Josh Seiden, who you may all know from Lean UX and Sense and Respond. Jeff has a new book coming out called Forever Employable. Slightly different topic, but Jeff's really, really sharp. They had a 2x2 that I loved, but then people kept struggling with, I don't understand my risk. And so I just started adapting it. And it's really funny. I started with this y-axis of, so this idea of like have evidence and no evidence. There were like 3 other versions of this before. So important and unimportant, people pretty much get, you know, it's like, okay, we write down our risk and we pull them over and we're going to map them important, unimportant. I think where people get tripped up there is like, well, of course I'm only writing down the important stuff, but some things are more important than others, okay? So sometimes things end up being below this line. And then the other was, I used to have known and unknown as the other axis. And what had happened was I'd facilitate this with very strong personalities, and they would say, they put something, and I would say, well, how do you know that? And they were like, I just know. And there was this really awkward pause. And I was like, okay. I was like, this is not working. So I changed it to certain and uncertain. We tried that for a while, about like a year. And I had leaders go, oh, I'm just certain. That's why I put it there. I was like, well, how are you certain? And it's like, well, I just know. I was like, no, we're back to where we were. So in working with Alex, he's like, look, let's just use evidence and no evidence. Like, either you have evidence or you don't. And we finally, after years of tweaking, we finally got to a point where teams are starting to say, oh, well, I don't have any evidence to support that. You know, so that's where we were trying to get to. This is part of Google's design sprint kit now, this little 2x2 exercise. So if you go to like the Google website for design sprint resources, it's like designssprintkit.google.com or something like that. You'll notice this is pulled into that kind of canon now. It's really interesting to get people to have a conversation on like what's important and where do we lack evidence? Because really that's where you want to focus your testing. And then how do you map your experiments to that risk? And so basically what it is we say, look, sketch out your canvas, write down your assumptions, come over the ones that when you prioritize or the riskiest, go run experiments to learn about that risk. And then come back and figure out, okay, what else did we not know? Is there something that shifts over here? And then is there something we want to update in our kind of strategy? And so it was really important to kind of put that link in between people have a canvas, are not really sure what their strategy is, where their risk is, other than will people buy it, you know, which is worded terribly, by the way. And then can we prioritize it? And so where the colors come in is with desirable, viable, and feasible. Really quickly, when I'm working with the team, I can find out, like, do you feel like you've ever talked to the customer? Do you have some desirability risk here? Which kind of harkens back to our poll a few slides ago. Do you have risk around, you know, pricing and cost, or do you have risk around kind of backstage and pulling it off? And it really depends on who you have in the room where that plays out. And but it's a really fascinating exercise. And the point of the experiments is that we've basically have a taxonomy with them where you can map your risk back to the type. So for example, what we did is we kind of categorized everything as discovery and validation. So pulling from kind of Steve Blank's work, 4 Steps to Epiphany, which was hugely influential on me. You'll notice in kind of, in Steve's world, it's very much a like customer development process, right? And we thought in this book, we wanted to go wider and we wanted to address a little more than just a customer focus, but heavily drawn on his inspiration. So we ended up framing things as kind of discovery experiments and validation experiments. And if you notice, each one of these kind of has like a D or an F or a V on it. Basically, that's kind of the theme. And some of them apply across multiple themes. So a big learning for me, and I've been doing this for a while, is when I wrote the book, I thought, oh, you know what, we'll just have like a list of desirability experiments and a list of viability experiments and a list of feasibility experiments. And what I found pretty quickly was, hey, it was a lot of duplication when you do it that way, because basically one thing can apply to multiple, depending on like the intent of your test. So we kind of landed on discovery and validation. So there's 44 of these. We've kind of categorized them by cost and by time and by strength of evidence. And with validation, you'll notice they're kind of fewer because basically they usually take longer to spin up, and you're putting something real there out in the world where you're getting value, you know, it's the value exchange. So we just wanted to, it doesn't mean you like linearly sequence everything, but we wanted to make sure that people had a kind of a mix of both, of open-ended discovery and more validation type. So jumping into one of them, you know, this probably looks pretty familiar to all of you if you've kind of been in this space for a while, but something as simple as an ad, you know, kind of pulling from Steve's work again, you'll notice this kind of pyramid on the right where you really, when you're looking at early adopters or early evangelists from 4 Steps, you'll say, well, people, do they have the problem? Are they aware? And then are they actively seeking a solution to the problem? And where I work with teams, it's like, okay, how do we make that actionable though? And one of the ways you make that actionable is when you run your online ads, you feel like, okay, well, am I pushing things to people who we think have and are aware? Or are we pulling people over that have, you know, they're actually actively seeking a solution? Is there observational evidence of them seeking a solution? So one of the projects we worked on, a new business idea I was working on, was around mouth pain. And early on, we did like Facebook display ads and like Twitter display ads. And we pushed, you know, these ads to some segments. And we used an ad to a landing page, call to action, pretty simple. Our landing page, I want to be generous here, was like 1% to 2% conversion on the landing page. It was really bad to the point where the team was like, you know what, there's nothing here, let's just give up. And before we gave up, and this is a really early stage kind of open-ended testing, we said, look, if you have this problem, where would you go? And some people are like, well, I go to my dentist or I go to my doctor. A lot of people said, well, we would just go online and search. And we said, okay, well, if we go on and look at search trend analysis for this phrase, is there any volume whatsoever? And we found out there was. So basically, before giving up, we said, you know what, let's try more of a pull approach. And we'll do kind of these Google display only ads, which basically means, I misspoke there. So basically Google search result only ads. So basically, think about like when you go to Google and you search, and they've changed this UI recently. Basically now it's even harder to tell what's an ad and what's a real like kind of search result, because it just has a little bold ad lettering above it now. But we thought, hey, if people are searching and seeking a solution and they see our, you know, result, will they come over? And our, I wish I was making this up. Our conversion, same ad, same landing page, was like 40%. And so that is huge. There's a 9-day difference between, you know, 1% to 2% and 40%. Now, granted, it's a smaller slice of, you know, people we're pulling over, But I mean, that's huge. It was really the difference between giving up or launching like a multi-million-dollar product, which they did. And so little things like that, I feel like there's a lot of great material out there for everyone to read, but it's not always well organized, and it's not always obvious how to make it actionable. And because I only really consult on real business ideas people are testing, I'm super interested in making it more actionable. So just something like simple like this, where, okay, well, if people have it and are aware and actively seeking a solution, what does that look from an experiment point of view? In a very real way, it could be the difference between you giving up on a multi-million-dollar idea or making progress on it. And so I think things like that, what we tried to do in the book was kind of call that out. You'll notice down here on the left, we also have what's the cost, the setup time, who you need to run something like this, and then also how strong is the evidence and how long it takes. So in addition to the themes, okay, desirable, viable, feasible, you'll notice this one's mostly desirability testing. So what we tried to do is say, look, from all our experience in working with teams, what are the things that kind of cost the most versus the least? What are the things that take a long time to set up versus run? And then what kind of capabilities would you need to pull these off? And it was pretty ambitious, I have to say. Even with 44, I think before I knew it, we had 200 pages in the book just of experiments. And I thought, wow, we have to stop this at some point, because, it's just such a dense book anyway. And once you apply this little level of taxonomy to it, which isn't perfect, I fully admit, it gives people a kind of a way to choose, right, in a very real way. Think of books like Game Storming from Dave Gray, or Innovation Games for Luke Holman. How do you actually like choose what to do? Because a list of stuff is not going to help you, really. It's just a list of stuff. We have other fun things in there like Boomerang. Boomerang, I noticed, is like when we point customers at a competitor's product. So my like favorite story to share here is I was working with a travel company in San Francisco. They were really worried about a startup travel company that was eating market share. And they literally just recruited customers and pointed them at that startup and did a lot of feedback, like, where do you get stuck? What's the value prop in your own words? Like having them share back what they thought, it was. And I just feel like from that startup's perspective, it must have been really awkward, because they probably saw their traffic spike and they're like, yay. But really it was like a competitor just pointing their cannon, at the startup. But some of that is in here as well. Like, what can you do without building, essentially? Like, can you test in a very creative way and treat it like an experiment and not rush to build? So that was a really fun one. I do this a lot in real estate now. We've done that in real estate at teams I've worked with, and just basically anything we can do. You'll notice, like, if you go back through lean startup literature, this is sometimes called imposter judo. I didn't like that framing, and I also didn't like the advice, because basically people said, hey, take your competitor's product and put your logo on it and test it. I work with like multi-billion-dollar corporations. I can't imagine them going, oh, let's just take the LinkedIn platform and put our logo on it and test that. Like, that seems like a great way to get sued. So I don't really, and I would say over the course of my career, I've changed my perspective a little bit over time about what is kind of, as far as ethics and experimentation. And I don't feel confident and don't feel it's right to just grab somebody's stuff and put your logo on it and test it. I just feel like there are better ways that we can approach that. One of my also favorite ones, concierge. So, can you deliver this kind of stuff behind the scenes, right? Basically, manually. And so being able to kind of white glove service, give value. You'll notice here, there's a person in the mix with Wizard of Oz, which is one that gets us compared to a lot. Wizard of Oz is similar, but there's no person. So it's very manual creation, and then you give it back to the end customer. You'll notice the evidence strength is really high on this one, but it also kind of takes a little longer to set up, and you need a lot of capabilities, because you're going to have to manually create the thing, And then it can test all three themes. So you can test out your feasibility behind the scenes, whether you can deliver it, you can charge for it, right? You can get feedback from the customer on it. So there's a lot of stuff you can learn. I think the big thing that teams push back on with this is they say, oh, we don't have time to do this. And it's a really odd conversation because I feel like, wait, you have time to build the whole solution, scale it and launch it and hope for the best, but we don't have time to manually test it out. So there's cultural thing that happens with this conversation. It's really interesting to me. But again, one of my favorites that's also in the book. One of the fun case studies we have is from Topology, which is a startup that measures your face from basically an app. And then they make glasses that custom fit your face. So imagine just scanning your face and then making glasses that custom fit for you, just perfectly personalized for you. Really interesting, I guess before the pandemic, right? They did a bunch of pop-up stores. That's how they tested out their idea. And so they had, an idea of what they were trying to do. They created a hypothesis. They ran their experiment. They generated evidence. They gathered insights, and they helped drive to action. And so basically the summary here is, they intercepted people on the street that had poorly fitting glasses, and they interviewed them on the street. Ones that were receptive, they walked into the store. They had the glasses behind kind of a case, so they couldn't actually get to them, but they helped them. They had a prototype, an MVP of the app. Would they be willing? It's really interesting if people feel like they're like behavioral desirability assumptions behind scanning your face, for example. It doesn't matter if your tech works; they're not going to adopt it. It's really interesting. This one, when I was interviewing them, and I've met them a few times, they ended up pre-selling some of these, and that's not even the goal of the pop-up store. The pop-up store was to learn and get quotes and understand more jobs to be done. And people resonated so well, they actually sold some. They also used the quotes from their interviews in their marketing copy later on. So if you look at their landing page, if you look at their ads, they used a lot of what they learned from running these experiments to inform their wording. And I think, one of the trivial things about it sounds trivial, but I think we always feel like, oh, we're just missing a feature. We just keep adding stuff in. But sometimes it's just the words you use. If you think about lean and voice of the customer, we're not actually using the voice, and we're not explaining things in ways people get it. So sometimes it's just literally changing the words to improve your conversion. It's not adding more stuff to your product or to your app. And so another thing we did is we basically created some experiment sequences. So this idea of, hey, can we kind of do some customer interviews and then, go online and look for discussion forums and then point people to the competitor product and then use what we learned there to do a clickable prototype and then go pre-sale and then maybe like create an MVP. I wish in hindsight that we'd given more attention to this in the book. There are a couple spreads on it, or one spread actually. There's a lot of pairings in the book, but not so much sequence. And I'm really curious, from the basically the readers, what kind of sequences they're going to come up with, because I think there's a huge untapped potential there as far as let's take what we learned from one experiment and use it to inform another. And it doesn't mean you have, 20 experiment long roadmap, but, even looking a few experiments ahead, it's going to help you with stakeholders basically to understand, hey, where are we? But you can't write a book without testing it. So, we basically tested the book. And so we had, I think, 3 personas in mind when we were testing this. One was the corporate innovator, like you're an innovator, you're trying to test new ideas. One was a startup entrepreneur, and one was a solopreneur. And so maybe a quick poll with all of you. I'm just really curious from your point of view, if you think of these 3 people, and maybe you are these people, or maybe you know these people, but who do you think needs the most help in testing their ideas? Do you think it's somebody in a corporation that's, in a kind of a incubator, accelerator, innovation group, or emerging product group in a corporation? Do you think it's a startup entrepreneur who's, trying to figure out how to launch their, startup and scale it? Or do you think it's a solopreneur that's someone that kind of has a side hustle or a student that's kind of working on something in their spare time? So
okay, everyone can vote in the poll. I'll get a few more seconds. All right. So there's the results. So 45% the corporate innovator, this 23% startup entrepreneur, and 33% the solopreneur.
Interesting breakdown. I think This was very intimidating for me because I do work with all three of these, but we were like, how do we create a book that actually doesn't feel like this disjointed experience and still strike at the core of what all, these people are struggling with? And so we did value prop canvases for each. So again, this is behind the scenes kind of book creation I'm sharing with you all. But we went through the customer jobs. We said, hey, from the corporate innovator, there's a lot of things about mapping out risk and collecting and generating insights, right? Some of the pains they had, testing is hard. We don't understand the process. We fear damaging the brand. That came up time and time again. I work with companies that are over 100 years old. They're like, we would never put out something that would damage our brand. People think it's a half-baked idea and they're gonna like write negative press about us and all this other stuff. Some of the things that came out is like, hey, we want to impress leadership. We want to socialize this and impress, help our own careers. And then we looked at it from our side and we said, okay, we have this book, the method, the library. Do we have pain relievers that will address some of these pains? And do we have gain creators that will, help create some of these gains? I have to say, I'm usually in a situation where I'm working with a team and helping them come up with this. When I'm working on my own stuff, I was like, oh, this is kind of uncomfortable. And I don't know if I really want to do this. And I thought, I just kind of want to write the book, And that's totally like, when I look at the product community and Mind the Product, you're probably the leading edge, like the product tanks and Mind the Product community. And you're more open to the idea of testing, right? But even me, I was kind of like, this is how we end up in this situation where people are like, just build the product. I don't want to go through all this because it's so hard. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, do we really have fit here and not? And so it was a really interesting experience to apply it on my own work. We did the same thing for startup entrepreneurs. Here, I would say the things that jumped out, resources jumped out time and time again. They're really afraid of like running out of runway. And communicating with co-founders came up because people just don't necessarily get stuff out of their head really well. I don't know about, I met some entrepreneurs in New Zealand and I thought I was really impressed with them, but we're not always the greatest at communicating what's inside our head to our teams. So that kind of came up. And then solopreneurs, this big one that came up was like turning my side hustle into a real business. And then this fear of like when to make that jump. Those came up time and time again with that slice. So we took what we learned. We obviously went to sticky notes and we started noting out the book. This is on a table in a cabin overlooking Lake Geneva in Switzerland. I have to say there are worse places to write a book. Alex and I went up into the woods with Alan Smith, our lead designer, and started like just literally having collaborative sessions to figure out how we're going to structure the book. From there, much like product development, right? We went through what would a sketch, like a wireframe of it look like. You'll notice here, I literally just have placeholder lines. I had an idea of what the kind of pitfalls I've seen and what I want to include in the spread, but I wasn't really sure about the text yet, but I knew it would come. So it's a very interesting way to write a book, by the way. It's almost like the text comes last, which is not usually what you would think when you go write a book. We create almost like a story map, but it was a book map. So we were distributed, like I'm out here in the San Francisco Bay Area. Alex is in Switzerland and Lausanne. Alan and the design team, a lot of them were in Toronto, Canada. So we had to have a way to geographically kind of come together online. We used a book map to visualize the book and move stuff around. I have to say, even here, there were big learnings for me, like, well, if we have the library up front, maybe people don't read the back. If we have it in the middle, maybe people don't get to the back. If we put it in the back, maybe people skip the front. Like there was all this, like where we put stuff and reordering it. So it was really interesting to work this way. And we layered in fidelity. So we said first sticky notes, then sketches, then kind of bigger mock-ups, and then kind of final, what it looked like. We did a lot of testing of the content along the way. So I'd ask questions. I would affinity sort the feedback from early adopters who were reading the material. It helped me catch some like conceptual flaws in the book of how we structured it. And I don't know how much like Alex's stuff, but it has to be conceptually sound. And so that was something we were always mindful of in writing the book together. I tested a lot of the content out on Medium and on blogs. This one was more of the pairing and sequences that I referenced earlier, but I was putting it out there to see what would happen. I could see who highlighted it. I'd have people emailing me going, that was amazing. I sent it to my VP of product. Write more stuff like this. Do you have anything else? So it was a great way to test like bite-sized chunks of content. We brainstorm titles. Of course, we take sticky notes to the top of like, mountains. This is us like putting them on the windows of the observatory. Some of the titles, obviously, I liked executing ideas as a title because I thought it had a double meaning, like executing, but really executing. Nobody got it. So we finally ended up with just calling it what it does, which is testing business ideas. We tested the covers. So I uploaded covers to usertesting.com. I sourced the people who were the readers, those personas, and then we had them explain back to us what they thought the covers meant. And the one I thought had no chance of winning was this one. And of course it won. I just thought this thing is so far out there, no one's going to get it. And by far and away, it was the most popular one. It also, people got it. Like this little blurb, I don't know, it's not so much subtitle, but this little blurb, intro blurb, and they're on the other Strategizer books, tested really well. They're like, you're holding a field guide. Okay, I get what the book's about. But something like we were just a little too clever with the imagery and people wouldn't understand what the images were. And so we did a lot of almost like comprehension testing with our readers to say, do you understand what this book is about by looking at it, which was really important to us. We kind of learned and iterated along the way with the content. One thing I would say in retrospect, we accidentally topped business entrepreneurship in Amazon without having a cover. So that was a little awkward. And I would say in hindsight, of course, we'd apply a time box to this in our best practice. But when you're down in the weeds, you often forget these things like, we should put a time box on our cover test so that we know like when to stop testing, because you just keep testing. Same advice I would give to a team testing their idea, a little more difficult to keep an eye on when you're working through it yourself. So I think through this process, I realized just the value of having somebody external come in and help, because even if you know this stuff really well, when you're doing it yourself on your own things, it's just so easy to get off track. And just even the best practices we evangelize sometimes get forgotten. But, basically the book came together. My challenge to all of you is like, it was product people, especially, you can influence more than just experiments in the product, that it's very much connected to the business. It's a system. Again, full color, beautifully laid out, kind of our stab at kind of giving something to the community where we thought could really help people when they're stuck. And yeah, it's awesome. Like it's my first book, it was Alex's third. And it's being used the way I had hoped, where people are using it more like a textbook. It kind of sits on their desk. They're not reading it front to back, but they're saying, I'm stuck. Is there something in here that can help me get unstuck? And that was one of the reasons. You come back to that job story. Like, I don't want to waste time building something nobody uses. So what is the thing that I can do to kind of generate a little more evidence to help me know if I'm on the right track? And with that said, we can take a few questions. We have about 15 minutes left, and I have a hard stop. So happy to take a few questions from the attendees as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much, David. That was really, really interesting talk. So I guess the question for me first, working with existing companies and trying to convince them that they need to do something like this. The problem is they think they know their customers, they think they know everything. How do you convince them to really, I guess, let go a little bit and actually go and explore?
Yeah, it's very much a personal thing. So I tend to look for stuff where it didn't play out well. So like if there's a situation in your company where you kept trying to solve a problem and we're never ever really able to solve it for a customer, I tend to believe that we didn't understand the problem that well and we jumped to solutioning a little too quickly. So I'll pick something like that, or I'll use different words, right? I'll say, I'm sure you're right, but can we go check? And that's something I blatantly stole from Eric Ries in working with him at GE. There were a lot of situations where, we would go, or I'd be in a company and people have very strong opinion. You'd be like, you know what, I'm sure you're right, but can we just go check that we're on the right track? And I didn't even really use the word experiment. It was more like, let's just go check and we'll just see. And little things in wording matter here. So I would just be mindful of the culture of your company and the words they use, And sometimes we get excited about our tools, but we shouldn't actually lead with the tools. We should lead with how are we going to make progress? And with executives, it's very much like reduce risk. How do we make investment decisions? How do we know we're on the right track? And talking in that way and just kind of nudging them, because it's very, very tough mindset, I think, for people to get into if they're just used to working with, I'm the expert, I know the answers, let's just build out these stories and go execute.
Yeah, I guess we want to do a little experiment because we might actually get some insights that we didn't know, and then maybe the management sort of think, wow, this is actually something worthwhile doing and trying and see what else we can learn. So, all right, well, let's run through some of the questions that we've got there. So a question from Ross. Been trying to get this kind of approach in my organization for a while. The problem with it is the culture is cultural as a management see this is slowing down and we have to suck up the jobs to be done approach. Any advice on how to help change the culture to adopt this kind of approach?
Yeah, I'm a believer in starting small and kind of building on momentum and socializing your successes. So I think it's tough in the abstract to convince people to get excited about jobs to be done or get excited about, using a canvas. I would say, with the exception, like I was hanging out at Twitter headquarters in San Francisco and Jack Dorsey said like, hey, we're going to be using jobs to be done at Twitter, right? That's a very specific example where he came out and therefore it's him. They're probably going to be adopting that a little more. And I think if any platform can benefit from jobs to be done, it's certainly Twitter platform. I'm cheering for them, but they have some issues. But culturally, it really, it almost reminds me of how Agile has taken so many different forms over the last decade. And it's almost always because of the culture. Like you can take the principles, but when they end up being practices in your organization, it kind of depends on your culture, what they end up being. And so I've been crazy enough to lead like org transformations in the past. And when I was doing that work, I just realized, it's very personal. You have to make the case of what's in it for them. And if you can find some opportunities to say, let's do small examples of this working this way, and then socialize the outcome. You want it to be a situation where they're kind of reaching out to you and going, how did you do that? And then you go, oh, we just happened to use a couple of different things. Yeah. But you don't want to lead with the things you did, because they almost always are like, oh, you just kind of want to use that here. And people will shut you down. It's amazing. As soon as they think you're more excited about the tools and the outcomes, which you're probably not, it's really tough. So I tend to go like small, socialize the outcome. When people are asking you how you worked, you start to kind of back into, well, we worked a little different to get to that outcome. I feel like that's a much more genuine way to approach it, and less if you like feel like you're banging your head against the wall repeatedly, which is not a fun situation to be in.
Yeah. Right, next question. We've got one there from Anthony. How would you adapt this approach in the B2B, B2E space? Some of these discovery techniques work really well in B2C. Are there specific approaches that work best in B2B where you've got a small number of large customers?
Yeah, B2B, I have a lot of B2B clients, and you don't have the luxury of burning through 7 clients if you have a total of 10, So what I've noticed more in B2B has been, if you look in the discovery section of the book, we have a lot of like facilitated exercises. I tend to use those. So we'll invite the customer in and do like a speedboat or product box or buy a feature, or we'll create literally canvases with them. But in B2B, the challenge is everyone thinks you're trying to sell them as soon as you start talking to them. And so no matter if you're doing open-ended discovery or what, they're like, yeah, you're just trying to sell me something. And so your biggest challenge there is like, how do I facilitate a conversation where I get to this kind of job or this like need behind the thing they're asking for, or we will eventually sell them? And so if you look through the book, a lot of the facilitated exercises I lean on. And then also like a lot of B2B is, people expect almost like a B2C like experience with B2B now, if you look at the products that are really successful. And so I wouldn't be too quick to discredit some of the B2C techniques. You just might be sourcing your customers from a different place. Like if you go to LinkedIn instead of Google, right? You still need to serve up content to a specific segment and see if they'll engage with it. It's just, obviously there's more risk involved, but I totally agree with the point of, if you have smaller batch of customers, you can't just kind of willy-nilly burn through 8 of them, because then you're like, oh great, now we only have 2 more to get it right. Like, you do have to be mindful of that for sure.
Right. Yep. Question here from Nadine. How would you advise the concept of MVP comes into this? Revisit the figure 8 regularly to ensure feasibility, desirability, viability are still on track?
So with MVP, I tried my best to write a book and not use that phrase. I wasn't successful, because it's been beaten up and shifted in so many different ways. I try to get to what kind of MVPs do I see? And it's Wizard of Oz, it's concierge, it's a mashup where you're taking existing tech and putting it together to deliver value. It's single feature where you literally just build the one thing. Like with Topology, it's just the app that measures your face. Like, that's the one thing it does. It doesn't do anything else. With Foursquare, it was like early days check-in. That was it. You just checked in. So I try to just take that nebulous MVP conversation and get it down to a more tactical level of like, okay, which ones have I really seen? And I haven't tried this framing yet. I'm really interested if you all agree, but I feel like your MVP should be something you do later down the road, and it should be testing all 3 of those themes if possible: desirable, viable, feasible. I don't think I'm totally off base on that, because if you listen to like Ash Maurya and people, there's a lot of like, a landing page is an MVP, and they're kind of right. It's just a value prop test. But if you put something behind that landing page where then you manually deliver people who signed up something, then that becomes more of like a concierge Wizard of Oz. So I'm just mindful of the thing, because I've seen some weird behavior where people just rebrand what they had as an MVP because they feel like that's the language execs want to hear. So they're like, oh, it's going to take us 2 years to build our MVP. And I'm like, all right, 1, that's not an MVP. And 2, like, where's your risk in that 2-year thing? Like, can we test that sooner? And so just be mindful of the way it's used in your company, and try to not get into conversations where it's like people arguing in a meeting what it means. Get down to like, tactically, what does this look like for a team? Is it manually delivering it? Is it doing it behind the scenes like Wizard of Oz? Is it just building a single feature thing? That's how I would approach it anyway.
Yep. Question here from Tim. How do you manage feature creep in the testing phase? For example, you're building a proof of concept to discover more about the problem you're solving, but then keep finding more problems to solve. Or the pilot customer keeps saying, we just need this next feature and it will be great. How do you know when to move on to the next stage of building a product?
Yeah, I think this is where visualizing it helps. If you had something like a story map or a journey map, I try to take this approach where I do the thinnest slice that delivers the value to the end. The problem with if you add a feature, blah, 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 that tends not to be in that horizontal slice. It tends to be going deeper on one section. And what I try to do is avoid going deeper, or at least find ways to fake going deeper. And it's tough though. One of the viral thing, I guess we shouldn't say viral anymore. It's probably a bad term, but the thing that went kind of crazy, I drew a product death cycle where I said, like, you ask people what are missing, you go build the missing stuff, and they still don't use your product. I think you do have to be mindful of like, why are they requesting that, and what's the job behind that feature. And so I think your only way to really try to wrangle that and manage it is to visualize it as like a map, kind of like we did with our book map, and then look for like, what's the thinnest slice, and then try to think of your releases as slices of delivering end-to-end value. I think if not, you risk your risk is you go really deep and make it really polished on one part, but then it still doesn't deliver the overall value, and overall the adoption fails.
Yep. All right, the last question we'll ask here from Dean. How do we get the right balance when sharing information on experiments so people feel reassured we're not just randomly trialing stuff versus not overwhelming them with too much detail in the experiments? That can be off-putting also and cause anxiety. We're overcooking things when we should be just getting stuff done.
Yeah, I think the way I try to structure it is you're reporting out the right level of information to the right kind of consumer of it. So for example, we'll do this thing where we do internal VC funding and we have to share out to execs. Do we pivot, persevere, kill this whole thing based on evidence and hypotheses we were testing? At that level, you kind of want to stay at the executive level and have all that detailed stuff in the background if you need it in the appendix. But the way we structure those, and I have templates on this stuff too, but it's like, what were the big risks in this product? how to, like, here are the tests we ran, here's what we learned, and this is what we want to try next. And they don't need to be in the loop like every day or every week even sometimes. It's more like whatever for your company, it could be monthly or, you know, quarterly even. And so that's a different level of like weekly learning reports where you're summarizing what you did for the week and sharing it to the team and other teams. Like that's a level of information a little deeper, but it's for a kind of different crowd. So I have to say it's really hard. And so if it's feeling hard to you, there's a reason. And mostly it comes back to at what cadence do you need to report out to? And then what level of information are you reporting out from your experiments in that cadence? And so in the book, I kind of frame it as ceremonies. But it's certainly a balance within every organization because you don't want to overwhelm them or cause a lot of anxiety, especially when there are different ways to frame it. So
Yeah.
I would just check out the ceremony section in the book. I do have like how to frame each of those and who attends. So that could be helpful too.
Okay, thanks for that. Handing over to you, David James.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, for this inspiring talk early in the morning for us. It was so good to hear some real life example of experiments and how you use it in different contexts. Just before wrapping up this session, I just want to talk about some upcoming events that we are organizing at ProductTank Auckland. And while we still going to have some of this talk, we have two very big events that's coming. The first one is the World Product Day on May the 27th. It's going to be a lunch session, and it's going to be with John Cutler. So again, if you can spare the time and be with us, it's going to be across multiple cities to this event. So we're very looking forward to do it. And the second one is we're going to do a virtual product unconference. So last year we did our first product unconference in October and we had amazing feedback about it. And despite the current situation, we thought that it was a good idea to try with a virtual product unconference. So we're going to organize one. It's going to be first half of June. We haven't nailed down the date yet, and it will be with all of you guys. So again, thank you so much, David, for the talk this morning. Thank you for the community for all the amazing questions you sent.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, David.
Thanks for having me.